Okay, hello everyone. My name is Kristen, and I am serving as an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. All of the attendants are on mute, so if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or the question and answer, and we will get those answered for you. At the end of today's webinar, there's going to be a short survey that we ask each of the attendants to take that just helps us with our funding and lets us know what kind of events to plan in the future. All of our webinars are recorded, so if you want to rewatch or share with others, this webinar will be uploaded to YouTube in a couple of weeks. Today we are joined by Brad Kindler and Sarah Buckley from the Nebraska statewide Arboretum, and they are here to talk to us today about drought-resistant landscaping. Brad is a sustainable landscape specialist and has a background in landscape architecture and horticulture. He is from Nebraska and has a small apple orchard planted on his family farm in Seward County. Sarah has been working with Nebraska communities for 7 years, helping plant trees and create public green spaces. As a sustainable landscape specialist for the Nebraska statewide Arboretum, she advises individuals and consults with communities on the best way to integrate green infrastructure and sustainable practices into their landscapes. So I will let them take it over.
Kristen, thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and begin this conversation here, and I'm going to share my screen, and I just want to get confirmation. Maybe Sarah or Kristen, you can let me know that everything is good. Yes, can you see it?
Yep, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to hope that everybody else out there in Nebraska can see it as well. So hello to you all. Thanks for being here. This conversation is going to be about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have Sarah talk a little bit more about some of the native plant choices that we might think of when we're thinking about drought-resistant landscaping. So this conversation that I'm going to present here this morning was also discussed about 1.5 years ago in our seed publication. This is what the Nebraska statewide Arboretum puts out, and it's oftentimes something that we use as an issue or a topic that we're going to want to talk about for the entire year. So in 2023, we talked about the lawn. And when we talk about lawn, we're talking about the area that you manage either through mowing or gardening, and it contains a spectrum of approaches and appearances. The reason I want to define this is because oftentimes we talk about the front yard, the lawn, the turf, the grass, and we kind of use these things interchangeably. But I want to just put a definition on what I'm talking about when I think of the lawn. Again, this is a managed space. Turf being the upper layer of soil bound by plant roots. It's most often grass, but it doesn't have to be grass. And so those are the kind of two differentiations that I want to make at the beginning of this conversation. The other terms that I want to define for us here is this idea of a monoculture versus a polyculture. So a monoculture, as the name implies, the word implies, is a single species of crop growing in an area, and it is of low diversity. Now, a polyculture has multiple species of crops growing in an area. They have a higher diversity, and that would be something like an ecosystem. So here's a graphic. Oops, before we go to that, let me talk a little bit about this idea of a lawn here. So last year there was an award for the world's ugliest lawn contest, and it was won by a woman down there in Tasmania. And I just thought this was something worth noting. It says, established in 2023, the most beautiful example of the most unattractive lawn for the most worthy cause in the world, water conservation. That's the genius of this competition. It uses humor to shine light on such a serious subject, and it awards those willing to proudly proclaim that theirs is the lawn which deserves disgusted glances from neighbors and a round of applause from around the globe. So congratulations, Kathleen Murray of Tasmania. She says, I used to think the bandicoots were a wildlife of mass destruction invading my lawn, but now I see that they've actually liberated me from ever having to mow it again. And she says, I'm all for guilt-free weekends, especially since my ex-husband left with the lawnmower back in 2016. I don't know if the Onion could have wrote a more funny article, but people are thinking about this idea of transforming lawn, or really what is this concept of lawn and turf and what's its value in our society. So for me, growing up, well, lawn did have value. It's the way you socialize with your grandpa. He teaches you how to drive the riding lawnmower back when you're a young kid. So they do have a place in our culture and our landscape. So back to this idea of monoculture versus polyculture here. So this graphic represents kind of what we're talking about. This first line says monoculture, and you can see on a spectrum between 1, 2, and 3, 1 representing monoculture and 3 representing polyculture. So this graphic 1 is showing monocultures, low diversity, and oftentimes more inputs. So graphic number 1 is characteristically your suburban lawn. It has no weeds. It's mostly grass species, hopefully a blend, but not necessarily. Number 2 looks more like a park setting. You have grass, you have some integration with forbs. It may be treated occasionally. It may have some inputs associated with it, chemical spraying occasionally, but that's an example of maybe medium diversity. And then this idea of a polyculture or high diversity, fewer inputs, higher diversity of species, and there's an integration of clover and other types of forbs that are found in that. So this is what I'm calling the lawn care spectrum. And this would be areas that we would mow. Okay, so let's look at these maybe in turn. Lawn number 1, typical suburban lawn look, managed in a way that presents the best possible grass with the least amount of chemical or mechanical inputs. These lawns are located in areas of high visibility and activity and are often weed free. So for us at the Statewide Arboretum, we recognize that there is a place for lawn, and often, we want lawn to be used. We don't want to put it in places where people are just looking at it. This lawn, for example, is in a park here in Lincoln. This is Woodshire neighborhood, so people are able to play in this space. But we recommend that watering be performed in these lawns when there's less of 1 inch of rain that's fallen over a 5 to 7 day period. Okay, so this is an important note. Oftentimes people are running their sprinklers without knowing how much water is actually getting onto their lawn. So one of the things that we advocate for, if you are actively managing turf in this way, make sure that you know how much water you're irrigating on a weekly basis. Sometimes people are they're over irrigating their lawns, or sometimes people are under irrigating, and that shallow watering is really creating the conditions whereby their turf is not deep rooted. It's very shallow rooted. So in a drought context, that can be a problem. So we use the University of Nebraska's lawn calendar, and I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. But what happens in a typical lawn like this is you're going to have compaction, and we recommend that you aerate and overseed every 1 to 3 years. And you want to overseed with a high quality turf grass seed. They're called blue tag seed. It's oftentimes a mix of species. Okay, not necessarily drought tolerant, but again, we just want to put it out there because it's a part of where we live here in Nebraska. People are interested in their lawn, so let's do it in a way that is a little bit more responsible. So you can go to the University of Nebraska's website. We recommend a tall fescue. Oftentimes there's tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass blends. And this kind of gives you a program for how you might want to manage your turf throughout the year. Okay, it's not my expertise, you guys. I just present it as a way to know that that type of turf and lawn has its value in the landscape, but it doesn't have to be everywhere. Here's another category. Number 2, turf that we recommend managing with less inputs and attention. It may be your front lawn, or it may be seen and used less. But think about how a park lawn is managed. So a park lawn oftentimes is maybe seeded initially, and then just what kind of comes up in there is allowed to come up in there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the opportunity, to have a lawn like this, I think is available for a lot of people. Mowing is the primary tool of management. And so in something like this, you might recommend interseeding with white Dutch clover to provide forage for pollinators and nitrogen fixation that comes off the root nodules in association with rhizobium bacteria at the base, or at least in the root zone of that clover plant. We always recommend mulching your clippings. That's mulching with a mulching mower, right? Chopping them up and leaving them in place. And then oftentimes there's no chemical or additional inputs on a lawn like this. We say leave the dandelions, right? But if you don't want to leave the dandelions, you don't necessarily have to spray them. You can dig them out. Or if you want to get rid of them, you spot spray them. You don't necessarily have to do a blanket application of 2,4-D and kill everything in this lawn. Okay, moving on to something that's maybe a little bit closer to what we're thinking about when we're thinking about a polyculture, or maybe even a more drought tolerant lawn. This is category number 3. This is any lawn treatment that incorporates a diversity of species, maybe a modified management practice or a variation on lawn as we know it. And so here in the prairie, there are lots of species that we could be talking about and integrating into our lawn polyculture. But if you're going to manage it, that is, if you're going to mow it, you have to put species in there that are able to resist mowing, right? So this idea incorporates something like smooth plantain, which is an introduced species, but there's also woolly plantain, which I think is maybe a more native species. You have purslane, you have prairie violets, self-heal, wood sorrel, yarrow. Yarrow actually is a really good species that you could incorporate into your lawn if you want to bring more diversity into it. It will persist in the context of mowing. Bird's foot trefoil, wild petunia, creeping thyme. Those are all opportunities of other species that you could put in there. So then it says benign weeds to let coexist. Black medic, plantain, prostrate, knotweed, dandelions, henbit. Oh, a lot of people, they think that's, the bane of their existence in terms of their turf grass. But in the context of a polyculture, henbit could be beneficial. Ground ivies, etc. So you get the point, right? This is an integration of more species into your landscape. Not only does it promote pollinator health and forage, but we're creating the context of diversity in our landscape. Okay, I thought this was kind of an interesting example. What about instead of a lawnmower, you have this idea of a lamb mower? And I put this out here again, just a bit tongue in cheek, but there are people in this country, primarily on the eastern part of the United States, that are moving livestock around and integrating them into kind of a business model for people who might want to have their lawn foraged as opposed to mowed. All right, I want to go back to this idea of a bee lawn a little bit because this is kind of catching some traction, especially in some of the seed catalogs that I've been getting this year. Twin City Seed, they have a specific blend of something they call a bee lawn. And you can see over here on the left-hand side, it says bee lawn seed mix in the red box. But they're using a creeping fescue, chewing fescue, a sheep fescue, white Dutch clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal. So really 7 species, not a ton, right? But these are a blend of mostly grass, and they tend to be non-native species. They recommend a mowing height of around 6 inches. So this is maybe an opportunity for somebody who wants to get a little bit of diversity into their landscape, but it's not necessarily something that's producing or allowing native species to thrive in that context. On the Prairie Moon website, they say a bee lawn was traditionally a blend of turf grasses and very low-growing flowering perennials to serve pollinators. Those flowering plants were often not native and included things like white Dutch clover and creeping thyme. There are, however, native choices in this category, and here are some of the options. So again, these are native species that will resist and persist in a context of mowing. Now, you might be mowing at a higher height, or you might be mowing at a 4-inch or a 3-inch height sometimes, but they'll persist in your landscape. So partridge pea, cream violet, prairie pussy toes, prairie sage. Again, there's a handful of native plants that you can integrate into your lawn that will persist in the context of mowing and then provide ecological value as a consequence of their diversity, flowering, different root zones. And generally, I think, visually it creates some diversity as well. So giving just a few examples of maybe what other options are out there. So I know we're talking about drought and drought-resistant landscapes. The idea of watering your lawn is a choice. Most lawn and grass species will have a dormant period in the hottest parts of the summer. So, in the spring, your lawn is lush and green. In the summer, it's going to go dormant. And in the fall, when it cools down and we get a little bit of moisture again, you're going to have the grass green up. So let's just be transparent. Drought landscaping is a choice, one. And if you choose to water or if you choose not to water, that's a part of it. But making sure that you have a species in there that can survive the context of not watering is what's important. So here's an example of fescue cultivars. Again, we recommend tall fescue as the primary grass that we would recommend for maybe an A or a 1 or 2 monoculture style lawn. But here's a blend of cultivar fescues. What they do is they allow it to grow up to 8 inches, and then this grass specifically just starts to flop. And so you kind of have this naturalistic, lush look. You can mow it as low as 3 inches, but you can allow it to get fairly tall as well. And so, for somebody who has a backyard, I really like the photo on the left. They have a deck, they're sitting outside enjoying it. They have this kind of lush meadow, and then it extends into kind of a prairie, a very wild prairie landscaping on the backside of it. So, here's an option for somebody who maybe has a backyard or maybe has a front yard with some shade. This is a possibility. Again, it can be cut as low as 3 inches. The challenge with something like this is most lawnmowers really don't mow higher than 5 inches. You can scalp your lawn, right? You can get your lawnmower pretty low, but you can't get your lawnmower very high. So, allowing this to kind of grow to a certain height, once you do mow it, you're going to probably have to bring it back down to 5 inches. So Sarah and I really like to talk about sedges. So sedges are grass-like plants, okay? And so just keep in mind that in Nebraska, we have a diversity of species. And primarily, we're thinking about, prairie grasses and then forbs or flowering plants. But there are 2 other categories of plants that we like to talk about at the statewide arboretum, sedges being one of them, rushes being another. Rushes very rarely used in our landscaping. Sedges are something that could be more readily used in our landscape. And just remember, sedges have edges. Okay, so in the context of our turf grass, nut sedge tends to be the bane of everybody's existence, right? The yellow nut sedge is something that, you're out there trying to kill with chemicals and yada, yada, yada. So when people hear sedges, they oftentimes recoil and they say, well, isn't that a weed species? Okay, well, yellow nut sedge, at least to my knowledge, is not native. So it does have the aggressive nature that can really take over your lawn. But if it's not that big of a deal for you, it's not hurting anything. Now, there are native sedges that we can use in our landscape to create a more naturalistic look. Now, Sarah has more experience with some of these than I do, but specifically Carex pennsylvanica, Carex brevior, Carex bebii, Carex appalachia for moist shade areas. Maybe in an area underneath a tree, potentially on the north side of your house, if you have a shade garden. These are species that kind of have a very naturalistic look to them, and they can persist in a little bit of shade. So that's an option. For maybe a drier spot, there's Carex albicans. So down on the bottom, there's examples of what these look like: plains oval sedge, Pennsylvania sedge. And then Monarch Gardens, based out of here in Lincoln, has done quite a bit of landscaping with sedges. And Benjamin Vogt has some very interesting photos on his website of how he's effectively used these in a landscaping context. So again, if you have an area with a little bit of moist shade, possibly a sedge is an option for you if you're trying to kind of create a more naturalistic look. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about individuals who have been doing this in the landscape. And so the statewide arboretum has a bunch of individuals who have graciously offered these photographs as examples of opportunities for doing something different in their landscape. So John here in Lincoln has a native and ornamental landscape. And again, I want to differentiate between this idea of lawn and turf, right? Turf, something that's holding the roots of the soil, or excuse me, something that's holding soil through roots is turf, right? Lawn could be really anything. And in this context, the lawn that he has is a garden. And you can see he has a really beautiful kaleidoscope of plant species, some of them native, some of them not native, a diversity of blooms, and just probably an enjoyable landscape to walk by. However, this is high amount of work, right? This is something that he probably enjoys doing. And if you're a gardener, you remove your turf and you can have a landscape like this, but it's going to take a lot of effort. And if we're talking about managing a landscape and we're talking about inputs of water and fuel and time, this is probably mostly an input of time. So I would imagine John, he could water occasionally. Once these plants get established, many of them are native. They probably have a very deep established root system. that thrives in the context of what we get from moisture in Nebraska. He may put a sprinkler on every once in a while. Oftentimes if you want your gardens to look better, it's okay to do some supplemental irrigation. You're going to get just a more full garden. Anyhow, a really good example of what you could do if you were to just remove all of your turf. Okay, so Abby in Lincoln also has this small patch that was right between the sidewalk and her retaining wall, and she actually removed it and planted it entirely with thyme. This is creeping thyme, Thymus cerphyllum. And so I'm not entirely sure how many plugs she had, but I would imagine this is probably multiple, maybe somewhere between 60, maybe 30 to 35 to 60 different 3-inch pots to kind of fill this in. I don't have a lot of experience with this plant myself, but I love what she has created right here. There's probably a lot of weeding that goes on the first year because you have to pull out everything that you don't want to be in there. This is an example of a monoculture. However, it's a monoculture of a species that's appealing to her, and probably anybody who walks by and runs their hand over the top of it's getting an enjoyable scent from the thyme. Really interesting example. Okay, so if you're going to do the hard work of removing lawn, removing turf, what are your options? Okay, well, maybe the easiest, but probably not the most environmentally sound would be to spray it. And you could spray it with a whole host of herbicides, but you could kill your lawn pretty quick in that context. And then what do you do afterwards? Well, you could plant right into it if you are going to be planting with some kind of container grown plants. You could mulch over the top of that and then plant into the mulch. Another option would be to cut the sod with a sod cutter, or you could do it with a spade, which takes a ton of work. I've done this multiple times for multiple gardens, and you're down on your hands and knees really cutting that sod. And then you also have to have a place to put what is roughly 2 inches of kind of grass and roots afterwards. So you got to have some holes you need to fill. One of the things we've been advocating for is the use of something called Weed Guard Plus. Now, these photos come from a project that we did down in Stina, Nebraska, and this project is going to be in its 3rd year, so we'll have a little bit more evidence of how effective this is. But specifically, this Weed Guard Plus is a 100% biodegradable product that you unroll onto the landscape, you throw wood chips on top of, through the process of basically creating a barrier to light. It will kill what's ever underneath it, right? And then this degrades fairly quickly, easily over the course of a season with consistent moisture. The process of decomposition occurs, and then what we do is we can plant directly into that. And so you can see here, we did a prairie restoration in this area that was seeded by hand, but we did 300 feet of prairie landscaping using this Weed Guard Plus. So we put it down, we put the mulch on top, and then a season later we came back and we drilled down, we put our bedding plants in there. So next spring we're really going to have a beautiful garden with very little weed pressure. Now, this is OMRI listed. For all of those who are kind of up to date on organic gardening and organic growing, OMRI listed tends to be a list of products that would be considered certified organic. Okay, so Weed Guard Plus is really it's just a paper product. It's cardboard or very small. It's almost like construction paper. It biodegrades. But I do want to note kind of a counterpoint to this argument. There's a woman who came and spoke at the Nebraska Arborist Association conference here this past month. Her name is Linda Chalker Scott. And she has a really neat blog called thegardenprofessors.com. And Linda posts maybe kind of what would be current research on what she considers to be garden myths. And so she kind of tries to tackle this concept of sheet mulching, whereas you might lay down cardboard or newspaper and put wood chips on top of it, and then that suppresses what's growing underneath it, and then you can plant into it. In essence, that's what Weed Guard Plus is. That would be an instance of sheet mulching, maybe with not so much layering. However, in her Garden Professors blog, she really tries to advocate for just the use of wood chips because what she considers to potentially be unsafe chemicals that are found in cardboard products. So Again, this is a counterpoint. If you're interested in knowing more about her arguments against sheet mulching or cardboard-based mulches, go ahead and check out her website. She also has a conversation about how they don't necessarily let moisture in and they don't let oxygen out of the landscape. Probably for something as thin as this, it's not going to be more than a season, but if you're mulching heavily with cardboard, you could potentially present some problems for perennial woody species. Anyhow, really neat woman. She's a scientist and a professor and much more educated than myself. However, from a practical standpoint, there's always a trade-off between what you can do, what you can afford, what you have the time to work with. And that Weed Guard Plus has been a successful product for us, for individuals who are not interested in spraying or removing turf through some other kinds of mechanical means. Okay, lastly, before Sarah talks here, I want to talk Stephen out of Aldersgate. So if you get a chance and you're in Lincoln sometime, go check out Aldersgate Church. It's over on 80th and South Street. Beautiful example of an institution and an individual who has taken a large lawn and reduced the turf, reduced the space to what is only necessary. And so they've categorized their lawns into A, B, and C categories. That is lawn that's used by the church, lawn that's maybe just visual, and then lawn that could be potentially turned into something else. And so at present, they have 12 different lawn treatments adjacent to their church. They have these different areas where they're kind of testing out maybe what is the right look that they want to have. So they have mini clovers, they have sedge lawns, they have a bee lawn, they have a really good example of buffalo grass right along the back of curb on 84th Street there. And they're also using rhizomatous tall fescue. That's a fescue grass that is moving through the soil through rhizomes. And so it tends to be, it creates a very hard turf layer, suppressing weed growth. So interesting opportunities of people kind of working with existing plant materials to see what would be a better option for them in their landscape. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to invite Sarah into this conversation here. If there's any questions, I'd be open to talking with some
I think you have a
folks.
lot.
Oh my gosh, I got a lot, huh?
There
Somebody
is
says,
one that I answered mid-presentation because I didn't want it to slow down the understanding, and I
sure.
thought the answer would go to everybody, but it just went to Annalisa, who asked if you could define forbs.
Oh, forbs. Sure. Annalisa, thank you. So a forb, in terms of prairie species, think of a forb as something that is flowering and has maybe a broad leaf. So grasses are considered monocots. So when they emerge, you have just one little leaf that's sticking out and they have fibrous root systems. Those would be considered grasses. Forbs have they're dicots. They have two leaves that emerge, and they oftentimes have a taproot. So a forb would be something like alfalfa. A forb would be something like clover. It could be something like echinacea, right? Those are all they have dicotyledons when they germinate from a seed. So hopefully that's a good definition. Sarah, do you have anything to add on to that?
That was great. I
Okay.
usually use the simple flowering plants versus grasses, but alfalfa is a good example because it's sometimes we think of it more as a
Yeah.
lawn type
Yeah.
planting.
And forb kind of sounds like forage, right? And so, of course, forage can be grass, but when we see alfalfa out there, people often say, hey, that's kind of for forage. And you could imagine that as being a good example of a forb.
Do you want to read the questions or would you like them read to you? What's easy?
Sarah, well, yeah, if you want to, I got to open up my chat here.
Okay.
Um,
Then there's some in both places, so I can read through them if you want. But
sure.
first, just a comment that Molly says she has far less trouble with rabbits in the garden when the lawn has some clover and dandelions because they have enough to eat.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to note. What are animals eating in a dry year? And I think last year was a really interesting example, not necessarily this past fall, although we did have some drought, but we had a little bit of moisture and it allowed those biennial species to germinate. But the prior year, there was almost no moisture in the fall. And so rabbits and other things were really looking for something to eat on last winter. And that's when they start to go after your fruit trees, or they're going to go after your shrubs or whatever. But if you have some of these other things in your landscape, they got something to snack on when it's you know, when
Yeah.
it's wintertime.
And Kathy pointed out that along with the sources you mentioned, Prairie Legacy also offers native bee lawns, and they're a great resource.
Okay. Right
Let's
on.
see. Joe wants to know if there's a place we can go to see a good example of lawn with Dutch white clover. White Dutch clover.
Okay, well, so again, I would just note that white Dutch clover integrated with a grass species. So for example, it could be a tall fescue blend. I don't necessarily have an example of where you could go to see that. However, I do know that there is plenty of clover growing in people's lawns across the state. And so I don't know if a pure white Dutch clover lawn, or I don't know of an example of a pure white Dutch clover lawn, but I would actually advocate for its integration with grass into the landscape. So again, if you just want to have a clover lawn, that would be a context of monoculture. And we're advocating for polyculture. So the integration of both grasses and forbs. So I don't have a good example, but what I would say is if you're interested in getting this into your landscape, you can seed in the wintertime. You can do a dormant seeding. If you aerify your grass in the fall, you can throw a white Dutch clover seed out and you're probably going to get some germination in the fall. And then again in the springtime, you're going to have to kind of rough up the ground and give that seed a place to take hold if you want to integrate it into your landscape. And there is a question over here. It says, where do we go to see a good example of a lawn? Oh, should you ever unthatch the lawn? Thank you. So this is kind of a follow-up. If you were to unthatch your lawn, you could overseed in that context, right? Because you're really providing some opportunity for more growth to occur. I'm not a turf expert. So if you want to grow good grass, aerify, overseed, occasionally dethatch if you want to. But again, that's not my expertise. And in fact, that's not where I would be putting my energy. I would direct anybody who has questions about growing better grass to the University of Nebraska's extension, because they really have individuals and professionals who want to do that very, very well. I, on the other hand, am interested in average grass with a diversity of species in it, and having a lawn that meets kind of my aesthetics, but also meets the maybe the perceptions of my neighbors in in a good way, right? So I'm going to mow it, and if I am going to do any kind of gardening in that context, I'm going to create something of a bed or a border or an edge that says this is my intention for this area, and maybe outside of that area, you know, is managed differently. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, Beth does not like your plantain picture. She thinks
Sure.
because it's not in the middle, and yeah.
Sure,
It's not-
Beth. So she was talking about plantain. I'm not quite sure. I see, yes, that plantain was a little down and to the left. I understand. Smooth plantain, you find it all over the prairies, and you find it all over our lawns. So yes, thank you, Beth, for pointing that out. The plantain is down and to the left on that photo. So
And how do you get rid of prairie fescue? Joe does not like how it looks.
sure. Listen, there are Kentucky bluegrass, there are fescues, there are all sorts of non-native and introduced grasses that are invading prairies. We even have, you know, south of here, they have old world blue stems, right? So we think of blue stem grasses as being native, and of course they are, big blue stem, little blue stem, but there are old world blue stems that are incredibly invasive in the context of pastures. And so I see this on here, a couple individuals saying bird's foot trefoil is invasive, ranchers are averse to it. These are all important conversations in the context of maybe living in an area where those could potentially be a problem. I understand that, but in an urban area, if you see bird's foot trefoil growing in the median between two roads, I think to myself, you know what? It's probably better growing there than not growing there, right? Because there's an opportunity for it to provide some kind of forage for wildlife. So I think there's a lot of gray area here, you guys. And what I would say is I'm trying to present an idea that there is a diversity of options, but that we have to understand that there's trade-offs to all of this, right? So if you're against a certain amount of diversity in your landscape because you find it to be weedy, that's fine, but recognizing that it has ecological value is important. On the other hand, if you think to yourself, I'm only interested in ecological value and I'm never going to manage this space, just keep in mind it might impact somebody else's lawn or perception in a negative way. So there's a trade-off there.
Brad, if you don't mind me adding to that one, there's a difference too, and I think, Brad, you separated it, but you didn't maybe specify exactly what you meant between species we add in purposefully to a landscape to increase diversity, and weeds we accept that were already there. And if I live in an urban area, I don't really care if I have bird's foot trefoil. It's a flowering plant. That's great. If I lived on an acreage and I neighbored somebody's property who would struggle with it, that may be a very different story. And there's a huge difference between accepting some henbit and planting it. So I just wanted to make that differentiation too.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's an important differentiation to make. Yep, there are some things that we can accept, and there are some things that, yeah, we might not want to encourage, right? So I see a question, and maybe just one more, and then Sarah's going to present a little bit about what are some options and plant materials for a drought-resistant landscape. But Kathy asks, name of the website of the woman that I spoke of. So Linda Chalker Scott is her name, and her website is gardenprofessors.com, gardenprofessors.com. And again, she has some really, really interesting information about kind of she's trying to challenge some of the myths we have about gardening. So even this we have another question down here about 30% vinegar. Listen, Linda Chalker Scott's going to have an answer to your question about, is 30% vinegar a useful herbicide? You know, there's gray areas here. And, you know, in my experience, those types of things can be effective, especially on sunny days. But if it's overcast and not very hot outside, I'm not entirely sure 30% vinegar is as effective. So anyhow, there's information out there. Let's go ahead and let Sarah present you guys, and then we're going to have some time at the end for more questions. So thank you.
Maybe once I take over, Brad, you can drop some links to things in the chat if you want.
You got it, Sarah. Sounds good.
I would add that while stuck at home during COVID, I did an experiment, and it's on the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum's YouTube page, comparing vinegar. Vinegar was something that I can't remember added to it, and just regular old Roundup. And on a very hot day, I think what happened was the vinegar just scorched the leaves. It didn't kill the roots, so it looked really good in the video. And what I think I said in the follow-up was it scorched the leaves, but it didn't actually kill the roots. They were back the next week. But there is the higher content cleaning vinegar. If you can get that, I get it at the hardware store. That's much stronger than just white cooking vinegar, and it seemed to have a little more lasting effect, but still like it was very effective, like in between cracks on the sidewalk where the sidewalk's already frying stuff a little bit and you stress that plant more. And I really liked that option because that's where my kids play. So, you know, there's a place for Roundup and there's a place for no Roundup. I'll share my presentation here.
We can see your screen, Sarah.
You can see it? Good, thank you. So I think I appreciate Brad's setup to maybe the more lawn or turf-like. I like your definitions. I'm going to try to follow them. Your turf-like lawn uses, and then I got assigned the non-turf-like lawn uses. So I just wanted to bring us into trees first of all, and there's a lot of the questions that I get, at least, are always pitting trees against our turf, like they're natural enemies and they can't exist together. And there's definitely, you know, some competition there, but we absolutely can have trees around our turf. And in fact, we need our trees around our turf. Our urban canopy cools our cities, and that in turn makes it easier to grow turf. Directly under the tree, maybe not, but in general, having trees in our landscape makes it easier to grow healthy turf with fewer inputs. But it's really lovely when we can remove turf under the trees when possible, and that might just be mulch, but that might be planting in communities and being able to put companion plants and shrubs underneath. There's a lovely example of that on East Campus, if you're familiar with coming in to campus in Lincoln from Huntington or Layton on North 38th Street. Just to the south of the greenhouses, there's a grove of trees with shrubs underneath, and some nice shade-loving perennials underneath that. And I have tried every summer to take a picture of that to show people what it looks like, and it does not interpret to a picture very well. So if you're in Lincoln or you have the chance and you want an example of what trees in community with other plants could look like, that's one of my favorite places. Oh, find my clicker. Okay. When it comes to how we care for our trees, this is where we can have trees coexist with turf well or not well. And I just always like to point out that we worry about the emerald ash borers and we worry about the rabbits, but humans are one of the most major tree pests. The damage we cause with mowers, the damage we cause with turf care, and the stress we provide through improper herbicide use under trees makes us a major player in the tree pest game. And mulch is one of the best tools we have for solving tree problems, but it can also become a tree problem. So in my pictures down below, I have on the left a really lovely mulch bed. It was originally applied nice and thick and allowed to settle. It's even, it's pulled away from the trunk. You can see the flare at the bottom of the trunk. There is a nice seedling there that somebody probably needs to pull out. But next to it, you have a nice example of mulch as a tree pest when it's in volcano form. So just because it's one of our most important tools, we say this about herbicide as well, a tool still has to be used right. And the main reason that we struggle with our trees and our turf is irrigation. We struggle with our turf around our trees because of shade, but we really struggle with our trees because the way we irrigate grass is not the way we need to or should irrigate a tree. And even the most, conservative deep watering recommendations for grass usually stop at 1 inch. And that's just not what a tree needs. It's not necessarily bad, but when we fall in the category of frequently watering our grass with shallow waterings, and we create a dependent turf. We make that turf dependent on us for water constantly, but we also encourage the trees to have an excess of surface roots. And I love this top picture that I took out in Kearney several years ago, is what those surface roots look like. That's a sprinkler head that the tree ate. And this was feet away from the tree. This was not right at the base of the tree. These two pictures have nothing to do with each other. This was feet away from the tree. The tree should not have needed surface roots up this high to that extent, except that this turf was very clearly watered multiple times a week, very shallowly, bringing those roots up. And then what happens when we get a year like last year where we start to have water restrictions is it was all fine and dandy as long as we were providing the water. But when we take that away, we have problems. And I like to look at what's underneath a tree, because the picture that we get in elementary school of, oh, if you flip a tree upside down, that's what it looks like, it's not accurate. Everything looks different underground than, even from one tree to another and from one site to another. But generally speaking, we have a lot more surface roots in a tree than we were led to believe. And the majority of tree roots are within the top 2 feet. And that's that top 2 feet, really, it's like the 6 to 12 inches is where the tree is taking in most of its water. Still not the top 1 inch of soil, and we need to get water down to those roots. And we need to consider those roots when we're maintaining the turf around the tree. It would be lovely if we could mulch every tree to its drip line for eternity, but that really only works for the first couple of decades. And then, we have a 20-40 foot diameter tree. It's pretty rare that we get to mulch that to the drip line. So it's just a consideration to have in mind when we look at how we're caring for the turf and the other plants underneath of that tree. And then moving from trees to kind of what happens when we want to remove the turf-like areas of our lawn and replace them with a more designed space. And Brad started to move into this, and I'll get a little bit more specific. But at the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, we do a lot of prairie-style gardenings. And an important point that I just want to start with is that we're not doing prairie restorations in everyone's front yard. We're doing designed gardens that are that evoke or are inspired by the prairie. We don't necessarily get to replicate them fully. We are working in a designed urban space in a neighborhood that's based on a pattern. It's used in a pattern, and so we like to see our gardens hold some sort of recognizable pattern. That's going to fluctuate in formality depending on how you like your garden to look, but we want to give it some sort of pattern. And then we need to recognize that some plants are better suited to a formal garden space than others, and we want to learn that about our plants and get a feel for their shape and behavior and understand how we can combine them into a garden that matches what we are imagining it should look like. I guess this is a little bit of a repeat, but since we have designed urban spaces, we want a designed garden. And depending on your property, depending on the use of the space that you need, you have more or less flexibility for a natural aesthetic. So from left to right this is my backyard. These are a lot of native plants. They're not strictly native, and it's a collection of stuff that I have taken home and planted in the space. But I recognized that my purpose was to be able to see out of my patio. So it might be an eclectic combination of plants, but I maintained a height. And like Brad said, there's an established edge that shows you where that landscape ends and my turf begins. On the flip side, the middle picture is the Quilt Museum here on East Campus. And this is an incredibly formal landscape using primarily native plants. They have some sedums and maybe a couple other species in here, but it's primarily native plants used in an incredibly formal way. They're really copying a quilt pattern in their landscape, and it's really beautiful, and just kind of gives that example that we can use native plants and biodiversity but still maintain a formal space. And then last but absolutely not least is a very natural style plant collection that fits in this yard. It's a larger yard. The plants are still in beds. It's not necessarily designed in a formal way, but it's designed in a way that suits the homeowner's purpose and doesn't infringe on the neighbor's use of their property or the sidewalk. When we go to learn about plants, I stuck a picture of plant labels on here because that's mostly what you get in a nursery, right? You might get a little sign that says, oh, its mature size is 3 feet. That really doesn't tell us even most of what we want to know about a plant. It tells us the mature size, but it doesn't tell us the things that cause variations in that. Does this plant grow to 3 feet in a lovely medium sun, nice moisture condition, but if you give it a little bit of extra water, it's going to be 4 or 5 feet? What causes, some variations in that size, and how much can it vary? The shape and texture, we'll get mature size, mature spread, but that doesn't tell me, is it a very vertical plant? Is it a very ball-shaped plant? What's its habit like? Does it stand up structurally? Is it floppy? Does it stay the same all year, or does it flower and then flop? Does it crawl across the ground? And then really importantly, how does it behave toward other plants? Does it spread in the garden by seeding itself or by rooting itself in? Does it spread aggressively enough to chase out another plant, or does it, share the space and move around other species? Is it going to be here for a long time, or is it pretty short-lived? And then is it sensitive to conditions, or is it pretty adaptable? And these are things you can't get on that plant card. So I always encourage people, if you're shopping in a nursery and you don't have all that information, Google image search is your friend. And I always look up, when I'm learning a new plant, I do a Google image search and I'm looking for that plant in a landscape, not in a test plot, because you'll get a lot of those. Oh, look, here's a nice row of this brand new plant we're releasing. I want to see it in somebody's landscape at its mature size. And in fact, I'd like to see it struggle a little bit so I can see how it's going to behave when it doesn't get exactly the conditions that it asked for. Color and bloom time, they're usually put at the top of the list. They're how we sort our plant list. But other than making sure that I have blooms all summer long, those are kind of at the bottom. It doesn't matter if a plant's the exact shade of pink that I want, if it's going to run all over my garden and chase out other species that I like to have. So I like to start with this because it leads us into, how do we design plants into a garden that we can have a recognizable pattern to and enjoy in our spaces. A lot of our lawns are limited in space, and we want to use them in a way that we enjoy. So the way I approach garden design is to assign jobs to plants in the garden. And you can see in my diagram, the jobs are based on color. And then I hire plants to fill those jobs. That's kind of the way I think about it. It maybe is a little silly, but it really helps me decide how to combine plants. And if a plant's not going to fit, I look for a different place for it if I really want to have it. So in a 100 square foot garden, I'm looking for about 50 plants. In a conservation setting or a more of a prairie restoration, I'd be looking for a lot more. But for me, 1 plant per 2 square feet is a very comfortable plant spacing for an urban space, for a design space, but it still fills the ground and shows me that densely planted prairie aesthetic that I'm looking for. And I'm looking for about half those plants to be our main flowering, pretty structural plants. And then I'm looking for some plants to just be my hardworking ground covers, ground huggers that maybe they're really pretty, maybe I don't really see them, but they're down there on the ground keeping weeds out of my garden, keeping my soil covered, making it so that I don't have to come in every single year with a load of mulch. And then something that we also think about, I thought about this from an ecological point of view. We learned when we developed this is our bloom box style of design that was adapted from Planting in a Post-Wild World by West and Rainier. We worked with the entomology department here on a grant that helped us design these gardens, and they pointed out that a lot of horticulturists are trying to get biodiversity in gardens, and that's a lovely goal, and we need to do that. But when we take it too far to the point where we only have 1 or 2 of each species, we actually make it very hard for the insects to find those plants. And they said, we'd really like to see you group, 4 or 5 of a species together in a garden to make it just a little bit more stable of a habitat. And I heard some designers reflecting that same thought recently too, that groupings of plants is a really quick way to take your design from something we do for fun to looking really professional. And I look for about 5 to 6 species max in a 100 square foot area. Sometimes less. Sometimes when I'm working with newer gardeners or groups of volunteers, I'll go down to 3 or 4 species so that they can really learn to recognize those plants, learn what their needs are and how to care for them before we add more diversity in. And then the fun, pretty plants, plant pictures that just to kind of show how I think about this. My first plant job in a garden is the anchors. If we go back to this, it's the purple. So there's only 3 of them, maybe 4 or 5, but they're the smallest number of plants, but they're the stablest. We want something that has interest all year long. Maybe it's the biggest, maybe it's not, but what it does is it provides the place that our eye can always focus on in the garden, no matter when we're looking at the garden. So Baptisia, minor or australis is one of my favorites. Early spring flowers, they fade, but the structure of the plant stays. Ironweed can be a little big for most gardens, but this is Vernonia lettermanii, which is the iron butterfly strain, and it's supposed to top out about 4 feet, and I'm watching it in my yard, and I haven't had it grow past that yet, because your regular ironweed is taller than me, and it can be a little bit much for some gardens. Any of the Amsonias, this is illustrious, but any of the Amsonia species make a wonderful anchor. And then New Jersey tea is one of my favorites. It's a woody plant, and that's a little different to add into a prairie garden, but it's a little 3-foot size shrub, and you can cut it just like a perennial. I prefer to leave it shrub shaped and large, but you could cut it back every year just like a perennial as well. The clean edge plants are our yellow plants, and this is where I include my grasses. Every prairie garden needs a grass, whether you're planting for pollinators or not. Grasses are critical to habitat for insects, and they're also critical to the aesthetic of a prairie garden. It's really hard to say, oh, look at my prairie garden, it has no grass. Grass is such an important species. But what we're looking for in our clean edge plants is things that help create that space. So it's great. In my yard, I've got brick borders to all my gardens. I inherited those from the last homeowners. Didn't even have to do the work for them. I love the stability they give to my gardens, but I still need plants along the edge that hold that shape and create that divide. And so I look to grass species, but then anything else that has a sturdy shape that doesn't flop or spread quickly. And we'll get to some flowering species too, but I wanted to separate out grasses. And in 100 square feet, I look for about 12 plants, 2 or 3 species. From left to right is Plains oval sedge. I love this one. This is late in the fall, so some things have kind of faded from this garden, but they really hold. I've got some side oats in there, and I've got some asters and some penstemons in that garden. And those Plains oval sedge really keep all of those species that fade through the summer from flopping into my patio area, because I just don't enjoy having plants flopping under my table. Little blue stem is a staple. Prairie drop seed for its airy fluffiness, but it's still a stable plant, even if its seed heads provide some fluff. And then for a little guy, the blue grama is just one of my favorites. I actually prefer the straight species. I know a lot of people enjoy blonde ambition for its size, but the little straight species blue grama is just a really cute addition to any garden, I think. And for plants, you'll notice that not all of these are native. Calamint is not native. Sometimes in an urban space, we look for plants that can solve the problems that we have. And sometimes we just accept that whether that plant came from here or not, the bees love it. So I use calamint a lot as a clean edge plant. It's maybe a little fluffier than what I described, but it holds its shape, it stays small, and it's covered in insects. Yarrow, this is coronation gold. There's many. I believe this is prairie onion, Allium stellatum, but any would work. Millennium, Cernunum. And then this is Penstemon calicosus or calico penstemon, but again, almost any penstemon would fit this category. And then our seasonal stars are kind of the last of the main plants that I put in any garden. These are the things that add our oomph of color, are often covered in insects, but they maybe need some help shape-wise. So that maybe there are floppers, or maybe they fade after they bloom, like columbine. But this is where our fall blooming things come in. This is where we slip in a few goldenrods, our asters, our liatris, yeah. And really, the categories here are a little bit up to your own definition. Depending on your aesthetic, how formal or informal you want the garden to look, you may choose to put, this is Missouri goldenrod, and I think it's one of the ones that stays the most upright in the garden for me. If you have a slightly more informal aesthetic, you may move that and say, oh, I'm fine with that being an edge plant. For most of the year, it's pretty straight and sturdy, and it just gets a little wild in the fall. Or you may have a very formal garden where some of the things I listed as edge plants are where you prefer to get your seasonal stars. All of this is just based on how I chose to hire for these jobs and what I wanted these plants to look like. What matters across the board is that we have some kind of pattern and order to the situation, but how you define that is up to you. The ground huggers is the hardest category in some ways. Even though there's 25 plants, I keep it to 1 to 2 species. I want this to kind of be the backdrop to my garden, so I don't want it super busy. I don't want to have 6 different species as a backdrop. And the reason we call them ground huggers and not ground covers is we want to separate ourselves from the vincas of the world and the aggressive vining, spreading things that are often called ground covers in a nursery. So these might be clump forming, they might be spreading, but somehow they can cover the ground and sit underneath our taller plants. So this is the ballerina geranium, but Geranium maculatum, which just isn't quite as pretty in a picture, would be a great choice as a native species. Creeping phlox is a really common one. Missouri primrose, and then this is the same oak sedge that Brad showed us earlier. And that oak sedge is quickly becoming one of my favorite problem-solving plants because it likes dry shade. And there are very few plants that like dry shade. This is under a maple tree in my yard, and those hostas took us a lot of watering to establish. That oak sedge, this was a couple years ago, so it wasn't last summer in the dry heat, but I think I watered them 2 or 3 times their first month of life, and then I got busy and I forgot about them, and they were fine. And I planted them a few other places just to compare, and when you move them out of that dry shade, you give them a little more water, they flop. You give them a little more sun, they turn yellow. They just really like the dry shade, and I love that because there are not enough plants that prefer that situation. So that's primarily what I had. This is a website from a talk I did a couple weeks ago, but it holds links to many of the things that both Brad and I talked about. And if there's anything that Brad mentioned that he wants to link here, we can add it to the page. But plantnebraska.org is the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum's website, and if you just add a /links, you'll find our more information about the bloom box designs. You'll find a cool season lawn care guide from Extension. There's some information on establishing new trees and plants. And then this is more pertinent to a different talk I gave, but if you're interested in just changing the way you maintain what you already have, Nebraska Extension Water Dogs will walk you through an irrigation audit to say, I don't want to get rid of my irrigation, but I want to make sure I'm using it responsibly. So,
Sarah, that's great. Thank you so much. Well done. We got a few questions here. Joe is asking, the aster that you showed, is that the stuff that grows in ditches? I thought that was chicory. Do you have a way to tell the
that
difference?
was sky blue aster. And
Okay.
at 75 miles an hour, I do not have a good way for you to tell the difference.
I'll tell you what, though. I think probably, Joe, you are seeing chicory because very rarely do I see asters growing in the ditch. So it's most likely chicory.
Oh,
With kind of a big blue flower on it, right?
yeah, I'm sorry. I misunderstood the direction of the question.
Sure.
Yes, I don't think that there is sky blue aster growing in most of our ditches. That would be an amazing dream.
That's yet
Yeah.
to come. That's
Yeah.
if we all get to work, that might happen. Okay, so I just saw also that the survey popped up on the screen. So if you guys would want to provide some feedback, that would be helpful for all the folks at Conservation Nebraska. If there's any more questions, we're certainly happy to take them. So I think in the question and answer space, you can type them in the chat, and maybe we'll stay on for about another 5 to 7 minutes here to answer whatever questions that you all might have.
So we have an interesting one from, I really apologize if I mispronounce your name, Idona. My thought is creating a big enough space to do all that instead of waiting for the grass to grow in. The grass and trees have different watering needs. I envision a round area with brick edging or stone, and we also have to be careful with the herbicide you put on lawn and getting that on the tree roots. I feel establishing that larger circle early, you don't have to worry. So, okay, I think I understand the direction of this question. Please comment if I am interpreting this wrong. Are you saying that why don't we go create our full-size tree rings of mulch to start with and put appropriate plants underneath of those from the very beginning instead of trying to grow the mulch ring as the tree grows? Some of that is it will depend on your property size, because some people are never planning to let that mulch ring get that large. I've taken both approaches. I'm interested to hear what Brad has to say too. I've taken both approaches, and I did find that you don't really need the larger circle in the first 10 years for establishing the tree, because it takes time for those tree roots to get out there. But it would be ideal, absolutely, for the tree roots to develop under mulch instead of under turf that we're constantly compacting with our lawnmowers. Practically speaking, it doesn't fit in every yard. And I didn't like having a whole bunch of open mulch, so I went in and planted a landscape in that area, which has a relatively short lifespan, because as that tree grows and starts shading, you have to be able to transition pretty quickly your plants from sun to part sun to shade. But when you have the ability, you will absolutely get a much healthier tree establishing without turf on top of its roots.
Yeah, that sounds right, Sarah. I would agree. You know, we do advocate for the separation between trees and turf. Although, let's just be honest, I mean, trees will grow in grass, but the long-term health of that tree is probably compromised as a consequence of compaction and various other things that happen when we have trees in turf, primarily hitting them with the lawnmower or the line trimmer, right? Because that can really mess up the bark, and then you start to have decay. And those are some of the issues that we see with trees and turf. But if you have the opportunity to kind of put in a large bed while you put a tree in, I think that's a great idea. But as Sarah said, you know, you're just going to have a transition in your landscape as it goes from full sun to part shade.
And that's not bad at all.
Not bad at all.
That it's just something to be aware of to start off, that I think sometimes people think perennials mean a very permanent landscape, and if you garden with prairie plants long enough, you'll learn that really only a tree, and even that is questionably permanent in a landscape.
Yeah.
Our landscapes are always moving around and changing.
So we got a question for plant recommendations for lawns with dogs.
I saw that.
Separation is it's a good start. You know,
Yeah.
oftentimes you might have to have places where dogs can be and where dogs can't be. But you got a recommendation?
I don't, except to say that this has been a well passed around question. A couple of our coworkers have had dogs for a long time. Brad has a dog now. And the general consensus seems to be that you have to be able to accept the aesthetic of the area where the dog gets to play. And that's just the truth. Otherwise, you're going to end up limiting your dog's ability to have outside time. And as the pet ages, it seems that you're going to gain some of it. It's kind of like having a toddler in a nice house. There's a period of life where your aesthetic has to change, or you have to be able to separate your spaces. That's where I would advocate for the schoolyard lawn, is what I call it. The stuff that's green that we mow keeps the mud out, and we don't worry too much about having really nice turf. And you probably do. Hannah, our director, talks all the time about, that now is my dog's plant because he likes to sleep on it. You either have to accept their interaction in your space or separate it.
Yeah, good answer. Anonymous says Heather Holmes' plan for soft landings under trees would make sense to install at time of planting. Yeah, and I think what she's or what they're referring to is soft landing potentially for caterpillars and other insects that are feeding on the tree and then drop out of the tree to maybe pupate or reproduce in the ground. So in this instance, some kind of shrub layer or other plants underneath the tree at the time of planting makes a lot of sense. Tammy says, yep, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I know Justin's kind of stepped back on the timing of that a little bit, where we found if you're not ready to do the extra work of watering, that it can be difficult to establish a really healthy tree and shrubs at the same time. And I found that even with sedges, it's still competition for the tree. I ended up just pulling out some sedges under one of my oak trees and saying, I'm going to let it be mulch for 5 years till I get past my tree establishment period, and I'm putting those back in. Just because those roots go so deep and so immediately compete with the tree. And that's what you see in a woodland, is a competition between trees and shrubs and who's, going to be there. And we don't have a great, any real hard answer on that, other than to say that the experienced tree planters are slowing down on that and giving the tree a period to establish before going back in with those plantings.
I think you raise a good point, Sarah. And I think for everyone who's out there listening, just to define that establishment period. So, when you plant something, be it a bedding plant or a tree, that root system has to tap into the soil, and it taps into it through its own roots, but it also taps into kind of the mycelial network or the fungal network. And so that establishment period can vary a little bit. For bedding plants, establishment can be 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. You're going to have to provide water for them. For a tree, an establishment period, especially if it comes bare root or potentially if it comes with compromised root systems, and you had to kind of cut that all away, you could be watering, of course, every week for an entire year or a year and a half. So I think that establishment period is important to keep in mind, and those plants might have different water requirements during that establishment period.
But I do think it's wise to think about it early, because in landscapes where we've gone back and tried to put in underplantings under 20-year-old trees, it is a lot harder, because your soil is full of surface roots. So there's a right time, you know.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, and then maybe one more, everybody. So Tammy is asking, my backyard is rather steeply sloped, shaded by trees, grass is sparse. Can I redo the landscape without creating terraces? Where can I go to get help and advice for that? So interesting. So I just want to note that, you know, tree shade affects the quality of light. So people oftentimes want to grow grass underneath their trees, and there's a possibility, but it depends on the species. It depends on the amount of light, right? And the quality of that light. And so those are kind of scientific values. You know, how do you know how deep your shade is underneath that tree? So one of the best ways, you know, to get light, to maintain your tree and have lawn, is to lift your tree. Therefore, you're going to get more light underneath there. However, you know, to answer your question, is there a way to redo the landscape and just say, hey, I'm not even going to worry about the turf? Yes, I think that's a great idea. You know, can you transition this shaded slope into more of a woodland style of space as opposed to turf and tree? And so you could start to interplant. I think sedges are a really interesting opportunity. You know, there's plenty of woody understory species that you could begin to integrate into a landscape like that. You know, the idea of putting a terrace, just keep in mind, if you have a landscape that's sloped and you have bare soil, you're going to have erosion problems. And I think maybe this gets to the heart of your question, Tammy, is the terracing helps with the erosion problem. So anytime you don't have something covering the soil and you get rain hitting it and you get wind, that erosion potential is high. And so getting the landscape covered with something is important. So, you know, begin to interplant with other species that are potentially shade tolerant. You could throw a ton of wood chips down on top of that as well and start to get some woody species in there. And there's plenty of native understory species that we could recommend as a possibility. You know, I think of things like that, at least from a native standpoint, you know, I think of Jack in the Pulpit or Solomon seal or Mayapple or, you know, from a woody standpoint, we're talking about buckbrush. You know, those types of species could start to establish and hold soil in that area in a transition out of turf. Of course, a retaining wall is much more expensive. So, you know.
I came across this question from somebody a couple weeks ago, and in talking to them, we kind of came around to the idea that there's an odd opportunity in a dry year to establish some of these erosion, you know, tending places, because we are in control of the water going down. So normally we have a very hard time establishing steep slopes with plants without coming in with wattles or erosion control or something. But we don't ever want to have, you know, droughts or periods without rain. I mean, I don't usually like establishing landscapes in them, but it is a chance to, you know, go in and plant and then water either by hand or with soaker hoses, which cause a lot less erosion and runoff, and get some of those roots established before we have heavy rain on the site. Just one small perk to a bad situation.
Well, you guys, we got people dropping off. So when we know they're leaving, either we're boring you or everyone's ready for lunch. So I think maybe we'll stop there. Kristen, I just want to say thanks to everybody at Conservation Nebraska who helped set this up. We really appreciate the opportunity. Drought is a challenge, and you really have to tend to your trees and shrubs in the context of drought. But we also know that there are plants out there that require less water. So it's a question of educating ourselves and experimenting and learning something. You know, what we experienced here the last 2 years in Nebraska in terms of drought is that a lot of our native species are tough as nails and they survive these droughts. They might have not have got as tall, right? But they still were able to produce a flower and have a garden that year. So.
Thank you so much, Brad and Sarah, for putting this on for us. We really appreciate it. I learned a lot, so.
Great. Okay. Well, if you learned a lot, that's great. We appreciate it.
Have a good one.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.